reopen the hearing on the unemployment bill. Can get what's the number? HB 2196. And today we're going to hear from, it looks like the only people that are testifying today is the Department of Labor, and I believe they're neutral on the bill. And first, they're going to give us a quick update on how the fraud is being detected. 1099s are being corrected, and they also answered several of our questions from previous committee meetings, and that was emailed out to you today with all of your information for today's hearing. So with that, we'll go ahead and invite the Department of Labor to join us.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir. Welcome to committee.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Peter Brady. I'm a Deputy Secretary here at the Department of Labor. And as the chairman said, I'll give a few quick updates to the committee before we launch into our testimony on House Bill 2196. I'll start with the deployment of Okta and LexisNexis, the two new security elements that we deployed on February 2nd. And since those were deployed, we've stopped over 1.3 million bots or other fraudulent attempts from accessing our system. Additionally, over 59,000 claimants have successfully set up multi-factor authentication and completed ID verification through LexisNexis. We have seen a few challenges with this new technology, but we've deployed fixes to address that. Overall, this deployment's been very successful. Additionally, on the fraud front, we're in the process of going through the 1099 process, processing disputes that individuals who either received the incorrect amount or received a 1099 and shouldn't have, getting those reissued to those individuals with either correct amount or zero. We're anticipating sending a large batch of those next week, and we'll continue to work through our process as those issues are we're made aware of those issues. The last update I want to provide very quickly is in regards to the Continued Assistance Act. So we did deploy on January 22nd, the new FPUC provisions, which is an additional $300 per week to claimants. Additionally, on Monday of this week, we deployed the extension to the PUA program, providing an additional 11 weeks of benefits available to claimants. And then our mainframe team is working now to deploy the extension, of the PEUC program. We're working on that, and we'll have an update on that in the days to come. All of that to say is we're moving very quickly on those CAA programs, and 2 of the 3 are currently in place. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I can pause for questions quickly, or I'm happy to go into our testimony.
Let's go ahead and take a few questions on your update. I've got one regarding fraudulent activity. If I had a constituent that received a letter yesterday that was dated February 5th, would that have been triggered well before the February 2nd reboot, or is that something that would have come out after you fixed the fraud issues?
It's possible it was before or after. Mr. Chairman, if you can Julie the information on that, because I'd like our IT team to look and see what the origin of that. I think it is possible it was both. It could have been before, it could have been after.
Okay, yeah, I'll get it and I'll email it to you. Any questions? Okay, seeing none, we'll go on to your testimony.
Okay, and thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for providing us the opportunity to testify in this legislation. I'm just going to briefly summarize my written testimony that you all have in front of you. I would like to say that the agency wants to continue to work with you all and other stakeholders on moving forward with stabilizing and modernizing our system. In reviewing this legislation, we see a lot of really great provisions. There's a few provisions that we're going to be neutral on because they're policy decisions for this body. And there are a few provisions that we can't support in their current form and would request some changes or modifications as they either present an operational challenge or a potential conformity issue with federal law. So with that, I'll start with the provisions that this agency is very strongly in favor of. The first one I'd like to talk about is the shared work program. KDOL agrees with this legislation. People who have testified to this legislation yesterday, that the shared work program really is a great tool, both for employers and employees. And we strongly support the change in the requirement for the reduction in weekly hours. Additionally, one thing this agency did this fall with some of the CRF funds that we received is increase the automation and marketing in the shared work program. This program saw a substantial increase in interest throughout the pandemic. So we wanted to invest resources to make sure that we could market it to employers, as well as automate the processes on our end so we could service those requests more quickly. And I believe with your testimony, there's also some of the marketing materials that we used throughout that we developed this fall. The second provision that the agency is strongly in favor of is the change to the provisions for professional employer organizations. Members of this committee may recall this was Senate Bill 27 in the last session. We support it then, we support it now. It simplifies the process for both our staff and those organizations. Next, I'd like to speak briefly on the provisions of this bill that we're neutral on, that we feel are policy decisions for this body. The first being the modification to weeks available in regular unemployment. The provision in this bill would return us to a structure that was very similar to what we had prior to the pandemic. So that won't create a significant IT challenge for our team. This provision would result in less benefits being charged to the trust fund and fewer weeks available to unemployed Kansans. But ultimately for us, we'll implement the policy decision this body moves forward with. The next piece I'd like to speak to is the review and reimbursement of all reimbursing employer accounts for the previous 20 years. Our agency is very strongly in support of ensuring that all reimbursing employers are charged correctly, and we want to do everything we can to make them whole. However, we'd like to point out that as this provision is currently drafted going back 20 years, there are some operational challenges. One of those challenges is that under current state record retention policy, some of the records required for these reviews may not be around, as their current record retention policy is 5 years. So we're not sure if we'll have everything available we need to do the full review. Additionally, the other challenge, especially with the 20-year time frame on this provision, is that it will require a substantial amount of staff work. We already have staff that are devoted and working hard, dealing with the onslaught of claims, supporting businesses and preventing fraud. So it would require the agency to move staff around to meet the requirement as drafted. What we want to ensure we do is we take whatever actions the agency can to make those employers whole, to review the reimbursing employer statements, while also making sure our agency's resources are best utilized. So we definitely want to move forward with this provision in some capacity, but we want to be sensitive to potential operational issues with how it's currently drafted. The next piece I'd like to speak to is the creation of the Unemployment Compensation and Improvement Council. KDOL absolutely wants to work with stakeholders in the legislature as we move forward with the process of stabilizing this agency and our IT systems, and then moving forward with modernization. There are two notes I wanted to make on this specific provision. The first being that as drafted, it includes some of the technological requirements. We believe both for security reasons and with technology developing so quickly, it would not be wise to put that into statute. And I understand that that may be addressed by this committee here shortly. The other concern that the agency wanted to raise is that we want to ensure how this council is structured allows the agency and the state to move forward quickly and aggressively with modernization. Based on the timelines in this bill, it's clear that we share the goal with the legislature of moving as quickly as possible in this space. And we want to ensure that the structure of the council is able to help the agency accelerate that and not create any unnecessary bureaucracy or anything that might slow the agency down. And Mr. Chairman, the next provision I'd like to speak to is the prevention of any charges to employers for claims filed between March 15th, 2020 and December 31st, 2021. We're very strongly in support of providing relief to employers during these times. However, I wanted to provide two quick clarifications here. The first being that as this provision is drafted, it does prevent the UI trust fund from being replenished based on legitimate claims that were paid. We'd be opposed to it as drafted right now. However, it's our understanding that this was a drafting error, and the intent of this provision is to only make fraudulent and improper payments non-charging. With that being the case, KDOL is strongly supportive of ensuring that employers are not charged for fraudulent or improper payments, excuse me. And that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to launch into the provisions that we are currently opposed to, either due to an operational concern or potential conformity with federal law concern. The first provision, Mr. Chairman, is adjustments to the timeliness for trust fund computations. We're very supportive of the goal of this provision to provide more readily available and accessible trust fund information to the general public. Our concern with accelerating the timeline on the trust fund solvency report is there's several processes that the agency has to undertake before we can issue that report. Those are outlined in my testimony, so I won't go through them in detail, other than to say that this is one area that, as our agency and the council laid out in this bill, looks towards modernization. We can look to find efficiencies and better ways to speed up the timeline to provide these solvency reports on the trust fund. The next piece I'm going to speak to is the new schedule for contributions from employers to the UI Trust Fund. Our principal concern with this provision as drafted, and you'll see this on the chart in my testimony, is that this does provide less revenue to the trust fund, particularly during times in which the average high cost multiple is lower. You may recall that when the average high cost multiple is lower, that's the time when the trust fund is least solvent and most quickly needs to be replenished. And our concern is that as currently drafted, this provision would bring substantially less revenue in than the existing system. We have engaged Representative Johnson on this committee to begin discussing what a new solution would be or what changes we could make to the schedule to ensure that the employers are getting an equitable structure while also ensuring that we're receiving adequate contributions, especially in those times when the trust fund solvency is at its lowest. And I will note, Mr. Chairman, our Director of Labor Market Information Services, Angela Berland, is on this call as well, and she'd be happy to speak to some of the details of our analysis on that provision. And then, Mr. Chairman, the final provision I'd like to speak to today is the addressing benefit charges and improper payments. This is the provision that either through the state general fund or other funds available would reimburse the UI trust fund for fraudulent or improper payments that have occurred. The one consideration that we would like to raise to this committee, and the reason we're opposed to this in its current format, is that we do have existing processes and procedures for recouping fraudulent or improperly paid funds. The concern that our agency would have in this space is that if the trust fund was reimbursed from some funds after this 60-day period, and then down the line, whether it be 61 days or a year later, we recoup those improperly paid or fraudulent funds through one of our existing methods, then we would essentially have two streams of revenue going into the trust fund for the same singular instance of overpayment or fraudulent payment. So we'd ask that the committee take that into consideration regarding that provision. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you and the committee for your patience as I walk through our testimony. As I said at the top, there's a lot of pieces of this legislation that the agency is supportive of and we believe can help move us forward. One thing I will note is that this is a very expansive piece of legislation, and part of the U.S. Department of Labor standard procedure is to review all state legislation for conformity with federal law. In the interest of moving quickly, we have asked the U.S. Department of Labor to expedite their review of this legislation, but to date, we have not received that analysis. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you and the committee for your time. Myself and a few members of our team are on the call here, ready to stand for questions when appropriate.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. You touched on a lot, and I didn't want to interrupt you as you went through there because you were kind of on a roll, but I want to go back and talk about a couple of things. The 20 years look back. Maybe I misunderstand the charge statements for the reimbursing employers, because that only has to do with reimbursing employers. And it's my understanding that in the case of a mispayment or a fraud case, that the charge statement is still there. It was paid, the money was paid, and it shows up as a credit. You know, it was the error was reconciled, and it shows up as a credit on their statement, but they don't receive those funds until you actually collect on their behalf. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, I believe so, and I'll turn it over to Laurel Klein-Searles, our Unemployment Administration Director, here in a sec. I will note that the concern that we raised, not necessarily the records related specifically to the charging statement, but if we're reviewing if we're reviewing simply for whether or not it ended up being credited back at some point in the future, I think that's less of a concern. The concern from our team was, if we're reviewing all of these statements and we don't have the individual claimant record associated with that employer charge past a certain period of time, that would create an operational challenge. But Laurel, I'm going to ask if you want to chime in here and verify the chairman's understanding.
Yes, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. So on the issues related to charges for reimbursing employers for fraudulent charges, our current practice is that if it has been identified that there is a fraudulent charge on a reimbursing employer's statement, the employer can protest that, and then we just remove that charge. So ideally, that charge would be removed before they even pay us. So I would like that charge removed, and in most situations, the charge is removed before we receive any money from the employer at all.
Okay, then those wouldn't be the charges that we're talking about here. The charges that we were talking about would be ones that were inadvertently paid and then credited back, but have not been collected, so they show up as a credit on the statement. Is that not how that works?
So they were inadvertently paid and then credited back as a result of fraud. So it would be prior to the particular quarter. I'm just trying to get some clarification around your question.
Right. So what I'm being told is that there are charge statements out there that have credits on them that haven't been collected by the Department of Labor. And those were the charges that they were wanting to try to recoup. And so that it would be fairly easy process to look through all the charge statements and find the credits, because they would carry forward each year until they were recouped by the Department of Labor and then reimbursed to the reimbursing employer statement. But I could be completely misunderstanding how that works, and we can take a deeper dive on it. But it was my understanding that it should be a fairly simple process to find any credits that are outstanding on current charge statements for reimbursing employers.
Yeah, it is something that I would like to be able to take a deeper dive. As you know, the fraud issue has really been exacerbated within recent months, and so we've reevaluated current practices and policies and procedures. We found that this current model, where we remove charges up front before we even collect anything from the employer, is going to work best on those fraudulent charges. I do know in the past, in some situations, and this may be what you're referring to or what you heard of, let's say we have a claimant that received benefits from a reimbursing employer, and then the qualification for benefits was appealed, and the appeals referee rules in favor of the employer and says the claimant actually should have been disqualified because they were discharged for misconduct connected with the work. An overpayment will be established, and then those benefits, or that overpayment, is not paid back to the reimbursing employer. until we've collected from the claimant. And so that's probably what employers have been speaking to you about, is that practice with reimbursing employers.
Okay, and I'm sure you're correct there. How difficult would it be to compile a list of all that? Is that a painstakingly long process as well?
It would be a somewhat painstaking process to do that sort of review. As Peter had indicated through his testimony, the records retention policies do not have us going back all 20 years, or as identified within the bill. And so if we were to attempt to go back 20 years, yes, that would be an arduous process.
How far could you go back currently?
Currently, I think five years, as Peter indicated, would be reasonable. It would still be a great deal of work, but I feel confident that we would have all the records necessary to do that review.
Okay, and then in your experience, can you give me a ballpark of fiscal note on going back 5 years? It didn't appear that there would be a whole lot of that, but I just want to confirm that.
I would hate to speak to the fiscal implications without examining it more closely with our CFO. I know we indicated that it would be quite a large undertaking to go back 20 years. Obviously, it would be much less than what we identified in the fiscal note for 20 years.
All right, I'm going to let some other people ask some questions. Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Peter, just to address a couple of issues here. First, seeing as how the legislature has already twice approved funding for modernization with no oversight, and nothing has happened, I think that concern over the committee bogging down the process might be unwarranted. But more to the point, you mentioned recouping of fraud losses, and I share your concern with backfilling the trust fund with SGF dollars. That's a dangerous proposition. But you mentioned that you have fraud recovery mechanisms in place. Within 60 days, I think is what we were talking about here. The fraud that started ramping up dramatically in Kansas in November, it's been more than 60 days. Can you give me an idea of about how much fraud has been recouped through the current mechanisms?
Yes, Representative, and let me clarify, the 60-day timetable I was referencing was the timetable in this legislation for identifying those improperly paid funds and reimbursing the trust fund. For our collections process and working with law enforcement entities to recover fraudulently paid funds, there's not a set timetable in which we're required to recover those funds. We work to do it as quickly as possible, but especially in more complicated cases, we have to work through our partners in law enforcement. And the other note I'd just add, Representative, just to clarify my own testimony, we are absolutely open to the oversight conversation, and we want to ensure that all stakeholders are included as part of this council. The only concern I was trying to raise that we want to make sure that with that oversight in place, we make sure that they can help accelerate the process for the agency and for Kansas.
I'd be happy if they just got the process finished at all. But how much of, you didn't really quantify as far as how much fraud has been recovered so far since November when the ramp up really took place?
And I'm going to ask Brett Flashbart, the other Deputy Secretary, to chime in. That he has worked with some of our partners in law enforcement to turn over cases on that front. Brett, can you speak to the Representative's question?
Yeah, Peter, thank you. And it's a good question, Representative. When we're talking collection work, it's a much longer game than just a short period. We can pull metrics on what we've collected, but those are going to be on fraud debts that were previously established in preceding years. There's a pretty lengthy process to fraud debt being set up. First, you have to establish that it has to become legally final. And then the various collection mechanisms we use, primarily the most effective being, I think we've testified to this committee before, is the Treasury offset program where you can seize federal tax returns. There's significant due process steps in terms of notice you have to submit on debts before you can take collectible action. So in terms of recent fraud debts, you're not going to see a rise in collection figures, but the collection process is one that runs full time, and you're working through basically your entire accounts receivable, so to speak, and trying to isolate assets where you can. So we're not going to have collection metrics related to more recent fraud. It's just a process that's going to be done by the agency over time. And to be candid with you, that's another area where modernization will help facilitate that process of trying to more efficiently collect on any past due amounts.
Exactly how will that be benefit? I'm not knocking it. I'm in favor. I'm just curious as to how the modernization is going to assist you in fraud reclamation.
Like everything else we do, it has to be, the simplest way to explain it is money ties to the mainframe. When you're talking anything with money, it's linked back to the mainframe. So setting up the accounts, monitoring them, the case management solutions that our collection staff use, it's all somewhat antiquated in the same difficult process that our CSRs have to use. So a more modernized system will allow better flexibility for staff who are actually working the collections amounts, more user-friendly for claimants who are actually wanting to pay it back, and making that process easier for them to voluntarily repay the money. The same difficulty staff have in working an appeal or assisting a call at the call center or collecting on a debt or working a tax case if you're an auditor, it's all tied to the underlying technology. Representative Sutton. It's a great question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Deputy Secretary, while you're here on the timeline and you didn't want to be slowed down by the committee, the oversight committee. Where are you? Can you give us an idea of how far along you are in the modernization plan? I know you started it quite some time ago. I don't know that we've received any kind of an update, but my guess is this far into it, with as much has gone wrong, that you've made it a priority, and I would imagine that you're well down the road. Is that a true statement?
Yeah, that is a true statement. There's still some final work that needs to be done in preparing to release an RFP in terms of building out the requirements and what the potential system architecture would look like, finalizing potential numbers associated. But the goal remains the same, is to proceed to an RFP in the next several months and then have the vendor selected and start actual on a project during this year. So we're close. We're very close. And I actually I was actually on a call over the lunch hour with the technical director from NASWA, going over some of his input on our current feasibility study. So he had some thoughts, and we're going to get with our team in the next few days and keep working on it.
That's good news.
It is, but we got a long way to go, and we'll need this committee's help and the rest of the legislative body to push us forward.
Well, I think that's the idea here, and I want to move on to the charge statements. Peter, you had said something about your system has to do too much to create charge statements early. Is that what?
Yeah, Chairman, are you referencing the provisions about the trust fund solvency report and all the processes that precede that? Yes, and then,
Okay, so that's what you were talking about. You weren't talking about the charge statements.
No, like I said, the concern I wanted to raise there was there's a provision in this bill which we absolutely agree with the intent of, to make the trust fund solvency report available 90 days after the end of the state fiscal year. And what I laid out in my testimony, those processes that is everything that has to occur prior to issuing that solvency report. I do think as we're having this modernization project discussion, and as Brett said, all roads lead to the mainframe. Once we get to a modernized system, I think this is certainly an area where we can improve our timeliness in getting that report out, because we absolutely share that goal of getting that information out and making it readily available.
Okay, not exactly sure, but I think that was kind of part of the bill for going forward with the modernization, and so that it would be easier. Once we have the modernization, we would be able to meet that timeline. Is that correct?
Brett may be able to speak to this in terms of that specific 90-day timeline. I do feel confident saying that once we are at our modernized system, we will be able to speed up our, we'll be able to provide those reports in a more timely manner.
Yeah,
Right, so,
and Mr. Chair, let me add on that. I mean, to tell you that the challenge is, I think this committee has noted it before. We currently only provide benefit charge notices once a year, and Unemployment Director Laurel Klein-Seals can also speak to this. You know, there's certain things in unemployment where if you're one of only 2 or 3 states, it's either really good or really bad. And I want to say 3 or 4 years ago, we looked at that and saw that we were one of only a few states remaining that still only provided those statements annually. We talked to the business community. We talked to some different third-party administrators, like what's the preferred methodology. They basically gave us quarterly with granular weekly data is what they would prefer. And we commissioned an IT project with our existing system to try and move to that, and we couldn't get it done. Like our system was so poorly fitted to try and produce that. We worked at it for almost 2 years. And again, I think we started this about 2017. We could never bring that to fruition because of the challenges. So not to belabor the same point, but there's any numbers of efficiencies and greater functionality that will be available to us down the road once we move past the current old and disjointed IT infrastructure that we have. That was an area where we recognized a need. We got good feedback, and we were unable to implement it just because of the difficulties within the mainframe and the Siebel systems.
okay.
Very frustrating.
Yeah, I bet it is. The proposed 90 days, I think, was an attempt to allow the business community to have a better heads up and budget for the following year, because when you get that solvency report, it usually comes out. You can start forecasting your next year because you're going to know your taxes are going to go up or stay the same. So on the charge statements, you currently are doing quarterly charge statements for reimbursing employers. What is different from a reimbursing employer charge statement than from the normal business community? If you can do it for one, why wouldn't you be able to do it for everyone, is the question.
Yeah, I'm going to ask Laurel to jump in on what the technical challenge was. Because as Brett was saying, that was what we had hoped to do, was to provide that quarterly as well. But Laurel, can you speak to what the roadblock was or challenge there?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So the biggest challenge, I would say, is that it's just the sheer volume of contributing employers. So we have about 97%, I believe, of our employers are contributing employers, over 75,000 employers, whereas our reimbursing employer population is much, much smaller. So just if we think about the quantity of work, that's a large barrier. Then when you look at the unemployment insurance tax laws within the state of Kansas, we found some challenges related to successorships and being able to adequately code that within our system. So as far as the coding goes, that's where the challenge was to break down those successorships and attribute the right proportion of benefits to different employers. Similarly, we had to look at what's the proportion of charge that should be attributed to a different base period employer. So we may have a claimant with multiple base period employers that all pick up a portion of that charge. And we don't have those same sort of complexities when we're talking about reimbursing employers. And so being able to take Kansas tax laws as they relate to contributing employers and translate that into a code that would interact with our system proved to be too challenging. We did actually do kind of a soft launch with our rated governmental employers that seemed to, we had success the first quarter that we did that. But then when COVID hit was when we were pulling together the second quarter for them, and we were hoping to expand out into contributing employers. And then removing all the COVID related charges apparently proved to be too much for our system to handle at that time, which is why then we had many, many months where we worked to get those charges removed from employers to reflect that on their annual statements.
Okay, so part of this bill reimburses or holds the employers harmless, and then also reimburses the trust fund. And it's going to be very difficult to figure out that number without issuing charge statements. And if we have to wait until the end of the year, the idea is to try to figure out the magnitude of the damage that was done and get the dollars back into the trust fund, especially with some possible CARES Act dollars coming down the pipe. It would make it a lot easier on everybody if we could have a better number. How would you propose to handle that? By making an estimation based on, what we know so far and putting those dollars into the trust fund and then reconciling it at the end of the year? Or how would you want to propose to solve that issue?
So I would say, Mr. Chairman, with the current limitations that Laurel just outlined, what you proposed would probably be the most viable avenue. As we had testified before, and as we said over the last week, the new tools we deployed on the 2nd have given us a much greater insight into the fraud challenge. And we're hopeful that between that and the Google Analytics tool that's currently in production, we're going to be able to identify that universe and at least have a very strong working number that we have confidence in here in the near future. So I think to that point, the analytics tools we're putting in place will be valuable in identifying what that number is. But to your point, and to the limitations that Laurel spoke to earlier, Mr. Chairman, having the true down to the cent number is going to require us to get to that point where we have the employer charge notices out. But I do think with the tools and the analytics tools we're putting in place now, we'll be able to get much closer to a working number in the near future.
So like in another week or 2 weeks or a month or?
I'm hesitant, Mr. Chairman, to give an exact time frame. What I can tell you is within the last week, we've made substantial progress in really narrowing that down and identifying because of what the Okta tools provided and what Google Fraud Analytics has done. I'll also note that we're working with LPA and we're now providing them additional information to answer their fraud question as part of that audit, which is supposed to drill down to what is the amount paid out. So we're providing additional data to LPA so they can assist us with that question.
Sorry, that brings me to my next category there on the recapping or recouping of the fraud. And so you've got a legitimate concern of repaying the fraud back into the trust fund and then recouping it from someone that stole it from us. Your concern is that it would go into the trust fund twice. Is that a U.S. Department of Labor issue that makes that happen, or is there a way to set up some sort of a revolving account that we can kind of track of what you've reimbursed versus what you collected and keep those funds outside of the trust fund?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and I can't speak to the specifics of what the USDOL conformity will be. Like I said in my testimony, we've asked them to review this and provide us analysis. What I think our agency would like to see is some sort of process outlined in this legislation that shows, to your point, Mr. Chairman, if it's a revolving account, or what that system is. But I think we just want to ensure that a system or a method is identified so that we don't get in that double counting situation.
Okay, good.
And Mr. Chair, to build on that, and I think we addressed this in a prep conversation prior to this broader committee meeting. It's hard for us. There's some areas where we're pretty confident that USDOL may have some questions or requests for clarification or concerns. This is a pretty expansive bill that touches on several aspects of the unemployment insurance program. So I think, as Deputy Secretary Brady articulated, just off my experience in the last, I mean, there's almost very few times we have any sort of legislation that touches on unemployment insurance that USDOL doesn't have at least some sort of inquiry, request for clarification, or notation on. So we do expect some sort of conformity review letter from them. It may all be fine, but it's likely that they'll have some requests related to some of the legislation. So that's just a process we have to work through. And once we receive that information, again, we've asked for them to expedite that review as much as possible. But they check literally every piece of unemployment insurance nationwide that's introduced during state legislative sessions and run it through that conformity process. So a bill this expansive that touches on this many subjects, we will get some sort of feedback from them.
I'm sure we will. I mean, I hope you told them this was an initial draft and that it's a work in progress, because my guess is it's going to change pretty dramatically before we finally pass this out of this committee, and hopefully they'll take that into consideration. Stephanie, or Representative Clayton, I'm sorry, has a question for you.
That's all right. I have a first name. It's okay to use it. So my question is sort of going out on what the chair has been saying. What I'm curious about is how often USDOL, how often do they contact you? Do you get weekly reports on fraud? Because again, to me, I just keep coming back to the fact that our system is under attack by criminals. Our constituents are suffering. And what is USDOL doing? How are they with communicating with you? Do we need to start calling our senators and congressmen to, push for more help from the federal side?
Yeah, Representative, and I'll speak to this first, and then I will let Brett chime in if he has anything to add. USDOL does issue us guidance in the form of view polls on a regular basis when new programs come out. I will say our primary tool for working and collaborating with other states is the National Association of State Workforce Agencies. In addition to weekly calls with that group where all 50 states participate, they also have the Integrity Center, which is designed to combat fraud and bring states together to find solutions to fight fraud. That is funded in part by USDOL, so it's a partnership between the states and the U.S. Department of Labor. Brett, is there anything you want to add in terms of our relationship with USDOL or that communication?
No, I think you covered, especially, and to clarify, I think we've mentioned this. If we throw out UI jargon, we apologize. UPL stands for Unemployment Insurance Program Letter. It's just a guidance document that's promulgated on the unemployment program. USDOL has kind of outsourced a lot of the integrity initiatives to the National Association of State Workforce Agencies. They do fund that. But I think to your kind of call to action, Representative, there is a lot there. I think in terms of when these expansive bills to provide assistance come into play, there needs to be better understanding at the congressional level of the challenges states will have, and more needs to be done on the front end in terms of when the legislation is put together to give states the necessary tools to prevent fraud. You're talking in California estimates of, $9 billion, $20 billion dollars that are out there. So any sort of administrative dollars or technology dollars that can be allocated to the states moving forward will pay for themselves in terms of the ultimate taxpayer costs that we're likely to see in this space.
I apologize. Could you repeat those California numbers again? Are they as big as you?
Yeah, and again, I know we talked on this extensively in terms of the estimates of fraud. And I know this committee has asked us to more clearly delineate that here in Kansas, which we're working towards. We've seen estimates in fraud of up to publicly available comments of $9 billion. There's been some talks of $20 billion or higher. Like all states, I think there's very few states that are definitively putting a number to it at this point. So when you talk about investing in state infrastructure and administrative capability for the states and being mindful of these new programs are brought online, I think $1 up front and some planning up front goes a long way towards protecting taxpayer dollars on the back end.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We talked about the fraud many times through the summer, through the fall. We talked about the fraud, and my understanding is that the Department of Labor sent or gave you $1.7 million for anti-fraud efforts, and I was just wondering what did you use that money to actually do? Because it doesn't seem like really anything was stopped in September and October.
And-
Go ahead, sorry, Peter. Go ahead, Peter, sorry.
Brett, chime in if I forget anything. Representative Hoffman, one of the biggest areas we used that funding for was to get Google Analytics and Okta and LexisNexis in place to provide that multi-factor authentication for claimants and account holders, to do ID proofing for all claimants coming into our system, and then to have the analytics tool on the back end. We've testified to this before. There's several other things we've done in the fraud space to include tripling our staff in that space. So we've done a lot. Candidly, and Brett, jump in if I'm missing anything here. The biggest challenge that we faced was taking these brand new tools such as ID verification and multi-factor authentication, and then tying them to and making them work with our existing legacy system. That was candidly just a very challenging task and took a lot of work on the IT side to get in place. Brett, did you have anything to add on the fraud question?
Yeah, give me one moment. I apologize. We have a fire engine going outside our window here. So, okay. I think Peter covered what that money went for. I would note, there have been large numbers of sophisticated attacks on the unemployment system every single day for the last several months. So while fraud has been a challenge, there has been countless number of false claims, fraudulent claims, attempts on our system that have been stopped. And I think the magnitude of that is demonstrated just by again, these aren't claims filed, but the attempted attempts to access our system just since we went live with Okta, was it last Tuesday? Time kind of flies by. We've been getting, I think, 3 times a day reports. I haven't read the last one, but if I'm not mistaken, we're either close to 1 million or over 1 million attempts that we have stopped just in that time period of attempts to access our system. So the fraud attempts on the unemployment system have been unrelenting. So there has been a substantial amount of fraud that has been prevented.
Well, I understand that. I'm not, you've stopped a lot since you rebooted the system, and what was that, 3 weeks ago? I was talking more of, before what, that's the frustration that I still have, is that through the whole summer, or through most of the summer and through September, October, November, December, that time period, it was like, yeah, we're on top of this, we're doing everything we can. But it's pretty evident now that you weren't doing everything you can, because once you rebooted and you put the authentication in, you're stopping them now. So, and then just another, I guess maybe a little bit of, when are we going to actually hear from the new secretary? She's been on the job, what, 2 or 3 weeks now? And we've yet to hear from her in any of our committees.
Yeah, I believe Secretary has been on for about 8 days now, maybe 8 working days. She's been on site that entire time. She has actually made different appearances before legislative committees. As you can see from our testimony, we have a lot in process right now. So Acting Secretary Schultz has been extremely engaged with the team and getting caught up to speed on all aspects of agency operations. We typically approach these hearings as a group anyway, but it's our full intent to have Secretary Schultz appear before these committees moving forward in the very near future. But as you can imagine, just off what we've had to brief you on these last several months, there's a lot going on at KDOL right now that she is getting up to speed on and getting her vision for the agency established.
Yeah, I understand that, but we are talking about a major bill here to change the way that the department is going to go forward. And I understand that she might not be exactly up to speed on everything, but I was expecting that she would at least shown up to this committee and said, this is who I am, and I'm on board and willing to work, and I have my deputy secretaries here to help me answer questions. But I appreciate the answer. Thank you.
Representative Auerkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen from the Department of Labor, thanks for your time. Appreciate the efforts a couple weekends ago with the reboot and adding just the additional verification. I guess one point on the numbers, and then I'd like to go over an idea, but going back to the California numbers, $9 to $20 billion, there's 39 million people in California. That puts us at about 1/13 their size, and it kind of, if we narrow that back to Kansas, it does put us potentially somewhere around $1 billion of fraud. So just in relation, Kansas to California, if those are the numbers California is experiencing, mathematically, we're probably somewhere around $1 billion if my numbers look good. But just listening in, new on the Commerce Committee, but the timeline over the summer and just some of the conversation seems like there's a struggle with solutions. The complexity of the unemployment, it makes it very difficult. But on the other hand, we have a lot of dollars going out. And speaking of business owners, there's a significant question about the trust factor. Right? Businesses are paying into this trust fund, and as it was described to me, it's a trust fund with a lot of holes in it. So I think there's a trust factor from the businesses that are paying the money in, what's going on with it. And really, as I see it, I think we're holding the money of these Kansas businesses, and that's a unique responsibility, and I think it requires and demands a ton of focus, and I say a little bit of separation from politics, and maybe some stability from one administration to the other. Just thinking about it, kind of, there are some similarities to the KPERS system. Right? KPERS is responsible for other people's money, their retirement money. You have a very unique board that really specializes in that one thing, taking care of other people's money and being very cautious with it, very deliberate. And so listening to the discussion over the last few weeks about the confusion, the complexity, and how hard it is, and it took many, many months to add just a second verification to the process, which seems to make a huge difference. What do you think about maybe separating out the unemployment insurance part of the Department of Labor and forming something along the lines of a KPERS board, an unemployment board that is able to put more focus into the responsibilities of the unemployment system? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Representative, I think you make a lot of really good points, because at the end of the day, the unemployment system itself is a partnership between the state agency, the employer community, and the employee community. There needs to be a lot of trust there between all of those parties. And I think you make an excellent point there. In terms of that separation and what a different structure might look like, I'll ask Brett to chime in with his opinion. I don't know what that would look like in terms of the federal law state administering the trust fund. In fact, you know, there is some specific federal law that we have to comply with. But Brett, do you know anything kind of more detailed on that?
Not specifically. I just want to build on a couple of things, Peter said. I'm not familiar with any state that actually has a singular structure such as that, where the unemployment insurance program is split out individually with some sort of board overseeing it. Regardless of the state governance structure, unemployment insurance is highly regulated at the federal level. There's a fairly substantive amount of federal oversight that all states have to adhere to, both in good economic times and bad economic times. So you can put a board, a cabinet secretary, whatever, but the program is going to basically be beholden to the same performance criteria. I definitely understand the concerns in terms of the trust that's put in to safeguard those funds. There has been extensive focus by this agency since the start of the pandemic on these issues. Just because the two-factor or the multi-factor authentication identity verification didn't go until recently does not mean that, as we discussed previously, any number of fraud prevention steps that were worked on by the agency We didn't see the identity theft really hit here in Kansas till a little bit later on. Some other states were hit sooner. Hindsight being 2020, there's perhaps always things we could have implemented sooner, but protecting the integrity of the trust fund is a core mission of this agency and has been something that has been the subject of considerable staff time and focus for the duration of this current crisis. The one other thing I'd want to note on, and I would just caution this, as I've heard this at a couple different committees in terms of attempts to extrapolate fraud projections from one comparison or another. $1 billion in Kansas based off the California numbers, or $700 million based off tied to some rate. I think, again, that goes back to our point. We want to base that on specific data as opposed to just kind of comparisons. So that is the number we are working towards for the committee. And I just would want to be cautious about throwing out fraud numbers that don't necessarily have a foundation in actual data that we can compile and demonstrate to this committee and the general public that we have accurate numbers to report.
And Representative, you made one other point that I just want to touch on very briefly in terms of employers and their trust in the system. And we absolutely understand where that's coming from. That's one of the reasons why we're supportive of measures in this bill, to make sure that we can make employers whole and make the situation right for any of them that were affected by fraudulent claims. So I absolutely share where you're coming from. That's why we're in support of those measures, so we can make those employers whole and start to rebuild that trust with the employer community.
Representative, yes. You made some good points there. It kind of threw me for a loop. Not that I'm surprised you made a good point, but that we haven't looked at it like that before. Because if you think about it, I mean, these are insurance premiums that businesses are paying in, and we, in a sense, created a $1 billion financial institution that's supposed to be there in bad times, and it's essentially now bankrupt after 7 months or 8 months. And so you made some valid points there as far as, I don't know about separating it out completely, but increasing oversight on it is certainly a good idea. I mean, there's a fiduciary responsibility there, and we don't know what the real number is as far as what was mistakenly paid out, but we've had pretty high estimates. And hopefully we'll get a better estimate from the Department of Labor as they learn things this week and next. But yeah, you made some valid points there. We should take a close look at that when we work this bill. Representative Auerkamp.
Mr. Chairman, just a small point is, for instance, maybe a member of the business community of Kansas on a board. I have heard comments that sometimes it was difficult for the business community to relay information warnings to the Department of Labor. Because this is the business's money that they've invested for their employees, that would be a small example. Is on that board, having a voice on behalf of the businesses, have a representative from the business community on that board. That's just a small example, but thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You have any further questions? Representative Williams.
Mr. Chairman, so, when we think about all, and this is going to follow up to Representative Hoffman's, when you think about all of the repeated directives from the U.S. Department of Labor, starting in May, and then the big one in August 31st, where the $100 million was appropriated to all the states, where we got 1.7 or whatever that number is. And then your response on how that money was used, that there was some type of multi-factor check, something was done. But really nothing got accomplished fully until January. That's 4 months after a pretty large alert was made, and it wasn't the first alert that was made. So I just wanted to ask a question regarding one of the things you've shared in your report back to us on the questions, You said that, or in this report, it said that 67,000 Kansans reported fraud on the website or by calling. But we know from testimony from the business community that between 21 and 51%, according to those that shared with us, had employees' identities taken and fraudulently. So somehow there's a big difference between that 300,000 number and that 67 that was reported. So I don't know how those people weren't alerted, how they didn't get identified. And I guess my specific question, and you can comment around that, is if somebody has an employer that's paying into the system for that employee with that social security number, and that same social security number is being used fraudulently and it's going into the system, I would have thought that that would have been a basic cross-check. Same social security coming in, same social security coming out. It's not a work share program. And so I don't understand why that wouldn't have been a technological upgrade. That would have been just, I would have thought a basic, gating measure. And I'm sure you had that prior. So maybe you can explain that type of situation, because that's one of the things I'm hearing over and over. I'm still employed, and I think that in this room alone, if we took a show of hands, it would be more than 6%. This committee room that's probably had their ID taken, and according to what you provided, it's 6%. So maybe.
So Peter, I'll go ahead and kind of take a stab at that, Representative. There's some good comments. Let me see if I can unpack a little bit for you. So first, at a baseline level, there are certain steps that were taken towards identity theft recently. But again, that does not mean that the agency was not cognizant of fraud from the very beginning. And there wasn't steps such as increased staffing, reviewing with the Integrity Center, having discussions on best practices, looking to block internet banks, all sorts of activities that were undertaken to try and prevent the fraud, okay? So we did not need a bulletin from USDOL in August to understand that there was massive concern related to both the regular unemployment program and specific to the pandemic unemployment assistance program. Every time there is a sharp increase in unemployment claims, there is a sharp increase in fraud. So there was agency efforts literally every single day from the start of the pandemic, in addition to trying to pay out benefits, with concerns on fraud and what the steps are that we could take. In terms of the numbers associated, again, in terms of the identity theft, we know this is a wide-scale problem nationwide. I know we repeat that every single time, but it's the cold, hard reality that every state is getting hit with identity theft. We're hoping to see a reduction with the new tools. The specific number of folks who have identity theft, I don't know if we have a precise number on that. We're aware of those that were reported to us. And the new tools will help give us a little bit better estimate. In terms of what outside parties have testified to, I'm not wholeheartedly discounting their testimony, but I don't know the necessary methodology that they're using on that. There is a chance that there's a number of people who had their identities compromised where the claim did not pay and they did not contact us. So we're potentially unaware of that. And then on your last question, Representative, and I apologize, I guess I'm not tracking you on the Social Security in, Social Security out. Can you kind of run that through one more time to make sure I'm tracking on what you're proposing or what your concern is there?
Sure. Sure. If you're a contributing employer, we'll just use those as an example. Your contributing employers, maybe not to the reimbursable ones, but if they're putting money into the system for a Social Security number, I would think that you'd be able to cross-track that with those that are coming out with the same Social Security number. So if they're using, I'm not employed by a contributing employer, but let's say my husband's, whose identity was taken, they would see that his Social Security number was there were taxes being paid for that. There was contributions made for that number. That person's still working. But that same number was going out the door. So if, that seems like a basic cross-check.
So there's a lot we've gone over. There's a lot of in boring, normal, non-pandemic identity theft craze. There's a lot of good old, that's what fraud prevention is for the most part, boring old cross checks, right? We do run an SSA verification on all claims that are submitted. The problem in this case is that there's additional identifying criteria that have also been compromised. We also do run all claims against the quarterly wage report. The problem there is a lag time. Okay, so all employers are required to file a quarterly wage report. So you're checking that, and those are done quarterly by employers. So that's not real-time data each quarter in terms of what we have for that individual Social Security, if that makes sense.
It does. It just, there is no way. I know that the U.S. Department of Labor, they put out a statistic. Well, it's just that we have over 1.1 million employees or working Kansans, and then they had a number there that said there were over 1 million original claims filed. Statistically impossible. So I'm just kind of surprised that it took this long to get on it. You said that. I think for everybody but the Department of Labor, we don't understand how the mistake could have gotten that big. And then now we're hearing estimates of $700 million is what we're going to owe. I don't know what your plans are, or what do you think we can do about that to recover that? Not recoverable, then how do we pay back the contributing employers, or all the employers, 60,000 of them? I just don't know what the Department of Labor thinks about $700 million, which seems like a reasonable number now. Thank you.
Representative, I just, again, appreciate the questions. And again, I think not to take it out of the public domain, but I think we would like to follow up with you offline and make sure we really drill down, because you've had some pertinent thoughts on this issue before. And I think we'd like to follow up in more detail in terms of your concerns on the cross-match process. So we'll have our legislative affairs team reach out to you. And I again want to caution on speculation related to the dollar amounts. I understand that there's other groups that have testified and put figures on it. Those other groups do not have access to our systems. They do not have access to the root data. And to just throw out, to be honest, there is no underlying data available at this point that would justify $1 billion fraud figure in the state of Kansas. We have no indication that $700 million is an accurate number. We know there's a large number of fraud, but to just put those figures out and say that is the discernible truth, I think undermines the exact importance of this issue, that we have solid data to support whatever figure that is. But $1 billion is a pretty weighted figure without strict empirical data to support that.
Well, in all due respect, I think you could do some basic math and say, well, if you have 60,000 employers and one fraud case per 60,000 employers, that's over $20 million a week. So it's not really speculating, these numbers aren't coming out of thin air. They're coming out of numbers that are provided to the U.S. Department of Labor. They're numbers that are provided by the contributing, the reimbursable employers. They're not, yes, these are estimates, but they're not estimates out of thin air. So, thank you.
Deputy Secretary, I think the frustrating part is that the only group that we haven't gotten any kind of an estimate from is the Department of Labor. And you might, if you were able to at least give us a ballpark, we could run with what you think. But when we don't hear anything from you at all, and we hear from industry professionals and mathematics around the country, it's hard not to pay attention to their estimates when there is nothing coming from the Department of Labor. And I know that you're working on it and that you'll have a better idea in the next week or two, and I hope you can get us a better number, because we really need to know what that number is, or have a general idea when we work this bill. And I'm planning to work this bill next Thursday. And so if you can't get us a number by then, we're going to run with what we have. And we would really appreciate you trying to figure that out before then, because we need to know a good number going into that day.
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. And again, I don't want my comments to come across, or the rest of our team, that in any way undermines or diminishes the importance of this issue to the committee. These are valid questions. These are relevant questions that go to the heart of the unemployment program. We know that. We're working to get that information to you. There's a little frustration on our part, though, when we say, industry professionals, many of them who we work with and have the utmost respect for, but blanket statements are put out there to the extent of, Kansas is the #1 state in the country for fraud, when there's no such publicly available rating. And if you talk to any state, if you talk to USDOL, if you talk to NASWAL, every state is getting absolutely hammered by this. So to pull that out, that Kansas is somehow an outlier, I think is where a little bit of the frustration falls on our part. but we will get you that number and we will get it to you as soon as feasible.
Okay, I've got one more question on the bill. We seem to have gotten a little bit off of track, so I'm going to ask one more question on the bill and close the bill hearing. If you guys could stay around to answer the rest of these questions, that'd be great. But it's most of this is no longer pertaining to the bill. And so my final question is, on the shared work program, that was the first thing you spoke about, and you said that you completely agree with that. Is that adequate? The way we have it set up, is it adequate for negative balance employers to take advantage of?
Mr. Chairman, I believe the language is adequate to take care of that, but what I will do is I'll make sure that when USDOL is in the process of their conformity review, they verify that that provision is in line with the federal provision for the shared work program. So I believe so on the surface, but we will verify that as well.
Okay, and then as far as the rate tables go, we'll probably bring you back with Representative Johnson and anyone else that can opine on that, because that's going to be a big part of this as well. We've got to get that right. And so, you know, we'll have that discussion at a later date. Representative Johnson, do you have a question on the bill and their statements?
Mr. Chair, that was my question, whether I should go into that offline or if this forum was one where we wanted to go deeper, in particular, kind of the elasticity of the multiplier that they had, how that had worked in the past, and to get their recommendation on that.
Okay, yeah, if possible, I'd like you to work with offline, and then that'll be one of the things we discuss on Thursday when we work the bill next week. There are no other questions on the bill. Representative Hsu, is yours around the bill, or is it a general question? Okay, go ahead.
I don't think it's thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't think this is a surprise what direction I'm going with this question, but it's about the IT requirements, and you guys have similar concerns as I do. But I do also want to balance that with the concerns of many members of the committee and the business committee as well. I do think some assurance is valuable. So, you know, I don't want to have the IT requirements written in the bill, but would you guys be willing to commit to using what's in there right now as a starting point, as the outline, just so the business committee knows, hey, these are the things that are important to them. Let's start with these. Because right now it's a large and expansive bill, and whatever we can do, I think, to simplify that, and then to be quite honest, to take a target off of our back. I don't like the idea of, you know, somebody Googling Enterprise Bus Kansas and our statute books be the first thing that shows up. I think that puts an unnecessary target on our back. So would you guys at least be willing to publicly commit to these things, and then maybe we can look at other options on these IT requirements?
I think we're willing to publicly commit to running an unemployment insurance modernization project that adheres to known best practices developed through the United States Department of Labor, the National Association of State Workforce Agencies, and individual states that have successfully modernized. And I'm assuming there's some overlap with what is those practices versus what has been proposed. And we're certainly willing to publicly commit to working with all stakeholders, labor, industry, the state legislature, to ensure the project is being run according to, again, best known practices for projects of these types. There is a considerable state infrastructure already, including the Joint Committee on Information Technology in this space. I think we're willing to go and be above and beyond that in terms of reporting and oversight to make sure that a project of this important to the state of Kansas is done the way we all would want it. But to, again, going towards specific technologies that were drafted outside the scope of these projects, and again, there is a relatively limited number of experienced individuals in this space. There's a limited number of vendors. There's a limited number of state solutions. I don't think we would be publicly committing to any sort of pre-prescribed technology, but we do want to work with everyone who has the same common interest of delivering the type of system that Kansas deserves.
Representative Long has a question on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So one of the major pieces of HB 2196 after modernization, is the goal to achieve a real-time interface between Department of Labor and employers so that they can access their account at any time and not have to wait for a quarterly statement or a yearly statement? And in that regards, maybe get ahead of something that's gone wrong. You know, how achievable do you guys look at this? Is this achievable goal? Because you're going to have to, every transaction's going to have to be entered every day to make it real time. And so I wondered if, you know, how hard that's going to be, and if there's other states doing that. That's a big part of 2196.
That is an excellent question, Representative Long. You know, we talk about modernization. It's not just to make it more efficient on our end. It is to really boost the public-facing features of the system for both claimants and employers. Employers are definite stakeholders. In terms of daily real time, I'm not sure if states, if they have that functionality. Again, we tried to do this a few years ago. What we really heard was quarterly with weekly drill down data was what employers were really looking for. They didn't have the need to look that up quicker, because there is a processing time on all these claims, right? There's due process, so it's not overnight that charges are put up. But getting more real-time information, whether it's a claimant just being able to log in and see, hey, I've got $4,112 left on my claim. That's 10 weeks. And these are the forms that they need me to upload in order to make sure my claim will continue without operation. Or whether an employer being able to pull up and say, hey, these are all the pending charges I have from the month of February. I can click and dispute any that I don't think is valid and not have to spend a substantial amount of my own staff time doing it. Those are all the types of features that we would envision for a modernized system to make it easier for all of our users. So that's something we're looking at with other states. Whether that specific level of functionality, Representative, I don't know, but that is the exact type of thing we're moving forward and would want to accomplish.
Representative Highland, is your question on the bill? Okay. I don't see any more questions regarding the bill or your presentation on the bill. And so I'm going to close the neutral portion, and I'm not showing any opponents to this bill. And so we'll close the hearings for now. The plan is to work it on next Thursday, and I'm sure that it will take more than just one day. Representative Highland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is about the actual people involved that are having problems. I appreciate that you've created a new address that we can send our information to about these individuals. My question is, it's obviously I sent several, and this one I received back. We contacted this individual and took steps to resolve the unemployment issue on 2/9/2021, and that was sent to me at 3:49 yesterday. At 8:20 last night, an individual I've been communicating with since last June or July, another upset email to me that he has not heard from you all. So who's telling the truth here?
I think, Representative, without knowing the specifics of the claim, I can't speak to that. If you want to forward that to Julie, I'll look at it. When he says he wasn't communicated with, I don't know if that means he didn't get resolution. So it's a fair question, but when we get into these individual claims without knowing the specifics of that particular claim, I don't think we can tell you. If we're sending out something that says it was resolved and it's not, that's an issue. That's a fair point, but we'll need that claim information.
Thank you.
Representative Clayton. Representative Carpenter.
Mr. Chair, my question would be along the same lines of Representative Highland. I've been sending people there all week long, and I've asked them specifically to get back with me if they have not been contacted. And while we were sitting here, I also got another email from a person that said she had not been contacted. It's gotten worse. I don't know what's going on, but this is these folks are desperate, quite frankly. Their rent's due. They haven't gotten unemployment for several months, many of them, and they're at their last deal here, and they still can't even get a phone call. So I'm very desperate, and they can't get through. So I don't know what's going on, but it's very, very disappointing.
Representative, it is very frustrating, and I think what we're seeing now is we're in the press a lot right now with this. The public realizes that we're working on this, and I think what we're seeing are the people that have just given up, ones that couldn't get in for many, many days, hundreds of phone calls, and just gave up, and now there's a gleam of hope for them. Some of them have lost their homes, their cars. So, I talked to a gentleman yesterday that is walking now because he turned his car into the bank, and he's walking to job interviews so that he can get a job so he can buy food. And so the human part of this is really big, and I think what's happening, and I spoke with Julie earlier today on somebody that was waiting on a call. It's been about 8-9 days. And she did indicate there is a backlog of, they're completely overwhelmed with emails from us now because the public is starting to realize that we can help them if they can get to us. And so I bet my guess is that explains some of it, but that still doesn't do anything for these people that aren't getting their dollars, and hopefully we can get to them quicker. And we've asked several times on the phone center, it would be nice to, we know we don't have enough people on the phones. Why don't we put more people on the phones? There was a finance council meeting today. I don't know if it was discussed. I wasn't there. I haven't heard, but I would hope it would be. Representative Clayton, you have a comment on that?
Actually, I do, and I just texted this to you, but I thought it might be valuable if I brought it up before the committee and our friends at ks.gov here. I think that there's a big disconnect between what we see, and one of the members of the committee brought up that it might be valuable if, and I don't know how this would work logistically with COVID, but if we took some kind of a field trip to ks.gov, I would really, for one, be curious to see a lot of these workings and to just sort of see it firsthand. So again, I understand it's logistically difficult, both through COVID and both through our very tight schedules, but if that's something that you would be interested in, either ks.gov or committee, I would like to explore that option because, I think that we all want to get to the bottom of things and do what we can to help our constituents. I am starting to see that backlog is being worked through. I have gotten some happy responses from constituents who had given up and who had gotten help. So I think we're slowly working through that, but I think that the more that we know, the better decisions we'll be able to make. So just would like to put that out for consideration. Thank you.
Any further questions? Representative Dodson.
Mr. Chairman, I guess one of the frustrations I have is some of the data. It seems to be accurate for itself, but it doesn't seem to build up properly. For example, I think mid last week we had something like 537,000 fraudulent claims identified. That is, they didn't make it through the gateway. Then I think on Friday morning I got a note from DOL and it said we've had 1 million. And then we had 27,000 that were accepted, 13,000 that were waiting. And if you look at the charts, 3% was for the last 2 weeks in December and the first 2 weeks in January. Then if you looked at the chart that shows the continued claims, that date set is off to the right of those continued claims. So when down in the narrative below then, you say, well, we've had 550,000 initial claims and we've had 2.5 million continued claims. So all that data is interesting, but trying to sort out maybe like on the chart that has the continued claims, how many of those were fraudulent, and if they're continuing, are we continuing, or is that million identified fraudulent claims driving that curve down, or when you continue a claim, does it last for a specific number of weeks so it doesn't have to be continued? I can take all that offline. I mean, that's a long question, and It's just frustration with trying to put these numbers together so you can make sense out of it.
Yeah, we're certainly happy to dig into the data with individual members, so we'll take note of that offline. And again, I apologize, we don't have prepared answers for all this. I mean, our primary focus today was the bill testimony, but we also want to be cognizant of the other questions in the space. So we'll make note of that question, Representative. I would, Mr. Chair, and again, we can have some of the staff. We do have some of our staff that has to be on a general government budget committee here in a few moments. So I want to make sure we have the necessary people if there's any other additional questions at this time.
I'm not seeing any additional questions from the committee.
Just wanted to thank you.
We don't have any other questions here. I have one final question around the identity theft. You said you put steps into correct identity theft in this, I'm assuming that's part of what you did in the 3 days that you were offline. There's been news reports with video evidence of being able to type in social security numbers into the system and download self-populated information. And so we have Kansas statutes that require us to notify individuals that happened to, or if we can't identify them, then we need to there's Kansas statutes that force us to notify anybody that's in the system that could have been vulnerable. Have you looked at that? Have you looked at getting the word out or getting warning out as per Kansas statute for the possible breach?
Yes, Mr. Chair, we are aware of a media report of an individual woman indicating she was able to access data other than her own. We are aware of that. We are following up on it. We also have a developed matrix that was done in conjunction with our Internet Security Office and our IT staff in terms of our reporting requirements. So, if the actual reporting requirements are triggered, if there's any indication that data may have been accessed, then we will follow all appropriate protocols. But the preliminary information we have from all of our internet security officials is that there was not an actual breach such that would trigger broad reporting requirements. But that's certainly something we are focused on and will meet all of our required legal responsibilities in that area.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Seeing no further questions, thanks again for your time today. And, from what I can tell from your presentation, for the most part, I think we're on the same page. There's a few issues we need to work through together, and it appears we're not that far apart on those either. And so I think that we'll be able to come up with good, solid solutions next Thursday. Thanks for your time, everyone, and we are adjourned.